Plato's Republic stands in contradistinction to Aristotle's Politics. Indeed, it stands in contradistinction to almost all other works of political philosophy because Plato never speaks in the dialogue. It would therefore be absurd to reach the conclusion that Plato's dialogues teach us nothing because Plato is silent throughout his entire written corpus, giving way to others not named Plato to participate in the Socratic dialectic. What, then, are we to make of Plato's Republic, that most famous political work of Plato, the most famous political work of all times? It is not coincidental that Plato's Republic deals with the interrelated relationship of his political philosophy and epistemology, which are tied to the unfolding dialectic between Socrates and the various sophists, especially Thrasymachus, Glaucon, and Adimantus. In fact, it would be hard not to see how the two are related and why. Even though the philosopher stands alone on the ship as the squabbling sailors and owner war with one another, the philosopher cannot escape the reality that the light of knowledge corresponds with the light or darkness of the city. If humans are, by their nature, political or social animals, something which Plato passed on to Aristotle, then it is all the more confusing that Plato's philosopher king appears to be disassociated with the city in every allegory contained in the Republic. Meanwhile, the real philosopher, Socrates, as we realize, is in the midst of social engagement throughout the work. Socratic irony is one of the most important elements to Plato's many dialogues, and this is especially true in any reading of the Republic. We already covered irony in Plato's Republic in a shorter episode leading into the introduction to this full summary and lecture on that most famous political work of all time. Socrates appears as an unwise fool, seeking wisdom from the sophists only to draw them into a conversation and expose their thoughts to the public. Another element of irony in the Republic is the hypocrisy of the sophists that stretches from start to finish. For instance, in Book 2, Adimantus joined with Glaucon in defending ideas of the good and justice similar to Thrasymachus's. And this was just another veil of the same kind of ethical egoism that Hobbes himself drew from without ever acknowledging. Adimantus, then, was vigorously defending a political ethic of self-advancement, self-interest, and the benefits of injustice at the start of the Republic. However, he later challenged Socrates that the guardian philosophers, whom Socrates extolled as the people who should guide the city, are rogue individuals who are completely self-interested. In the long-winded conversation between Socrates and Adimantus, Socrates has managed to expose Adimantus as a hypocrite. This is made all the more ironic when, at the conclusion of the dialectic between the two, when Adimantus and Glaucon implored Socrates to remain in their company to expound about his idea of justice rather than desert them. "By God, Socrates," Glaucon said, "don't desert us with the end almost in sight. We'll be satisfied if you discuss the good as you discuss justice, moderation, and the rest." This is not meant to be lost upon the reader that Adimantus and the rest of the sophists are hypocritical in their teaching of ethical egoism because it suits them while vigorously opposing any notion of justice that displaces their primacy in the city. While the central theme of Plato's Republic is justice, the quintessential question of the Republic is what kind of city do we live in? This is critical to understanding the true impetus of Plato's political philosophy. It is not necessarily a question, an examination about what kind of city we should aim for, though that is certainly wrapped up within the pages of the work, but it is primarily an examination of what kind of city we live in now. This is important because we are political animals, and the city is, as both Plato and his student Aristotle rightly identify, the highest artful endeavor that humans work and participate in. The city is the telos to humanity's social animus throughout classical political philosophy. Therefore, any reading of Plato's Republic would be incomplete without addressing the question of what kind of city did Plato see himself inhabiting and responding to in his work. After all, we cannot give a prescription, a medicine to a problem unless we know the problem. Thus, in order to achieve the ideal city, we must first understand what the problems of our city actually are. To this end, it is obvious as to why Socrates converses with the Sophists. The Sophists are the leaders and supposed wise men of the city of Athens. And who better to analyze in seeking to understand what kind of a city one is living in than to scrutinize the leaders and wise men who are also mentoring the next generation of Athenian leaders. The most memorable sophist in Plato's Republic is Thrasymachus, even though he quickly fades from the scene after the first book. Thrasymachus is the perfect opposite and foil to Socrates at every level. Not only is he the one who offers the most savage view of justice, that justice is in the interest of the stronger, he is also the most base in his responses. Even Polemarchus and Cephalus were more eloquent in their attempts to justify their views of justice than Thrasymachus' angered and acute outbursts, like when he says, "I say that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Well, why don't you praise me?" It is also fitting of Thrasymachus to seek praise from Socrates for his brief explanation of justice in lieu of the money he demanded before speaking. There is an additional irony to Thrasymachus as the savage and wild man, encountering the gentle Socrates, who becomes the tamer of Thrasymachus by the end of their encounter. We first meet Thrasymachus as a detached listener, but as he is about to enter into the conversation, Plato describes him in animalistic and predatory language, which is meant to convey, even before he speaks, his savage nature. As we mentioned in our short episode explaining Socratic and Platonic irony in the Republic, Thrasymachus' name means savage beast or warrior. While knowledge of Greek can help you understand the irony and bring you into the window of irony better, even without that knowledge of Greek, you can begin to see the savage nature that Plato is lampooning. As Plato says, Thrasymachus coiled himself up like a wild beast about to spring, and he hurled himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. Socrates even exclaims that he was startled from the ambush, from the predatory pounce. Polemarchus and I were frightened and flustered as he roared into our midst. From his first appearance to his first interjection, Thrasymachus is meant to be visualized as a wild and uncontrollable man, like a predatory beast waiting to ambush his prey, itself reflective of his dog-eat-dog worldview. Thrasymachus is not a human. He is not even a barbarian. He is something less than human. He is a wild beast. Thrasymachus and Socrates begin their conversation on the nature of justice with Thrasymachus assailing Socrates for asking too many questions instead of providing an answer. This represents the difference between the inquisitive and thoughtful philosopher over and against the pragmatic politician of ready-made answers. The wise man is inquisitive and asks questions and receives the knowledge and formulates his own thoughts accordingly. The pragmatic politician, the sophist, is the ideological man who has ready-made answers on the stump. After a short exchange, Socrates is attuned to Thrasymachus' seething anger for being made to look like a fool. "And you think that I asked the questions I did in order for you to harm me in the argument?" questions Socrates. Thrasymachus, in his own Thrasymachus style, answers, "I know it very well, but it won't do you any good. You'll never be able to trick me, so you can't harm me that way. And without trickery, you'll never be able to overpower me in the argument." When invited to critically participate in the conversation concerning the nature of justice, Thrasymachus postures to defend his power and ape-like character, to scare off Socrates from his turf. It is amusing to note here that from Thrasymachus' perspective, the inquiry and conversation over the nature of justice has become something of a wrestling contest between him and Socrates, and one that he is not ready to lose unless Socrates engages in, quote, trickery. Thrasymachus is not interested in learning, as his outbursts reveal to us. That much should be understood by the reader of the text. He is only interested in advancing his own ideal, prestige, and power by any means, quite literally, necessary. Thrasymachus is living up to his name as well as his beastly reputation. It is also interesting to highlight that Thrasymachus, who in defending a view of justice, which is centered on power, also sees speech as reflecting power. Like a territorial beast, Thrasymachus muscles up to guard his turf against Socrates' encroachment. Thrasymachus again retorts to Socrates that he will not be able to overpower him in an argument. The image of beastly animal still lingers over Thrasymachus, which is not meant to be lost on us as readers. Thrasymachus sees the Socratic dialectic of inquiring about justice and leading to an understanding of justice as principally being about himself and Socrates' supposed attempt to harm him in the argument. Thrasymachus doesn't even respond to Socrates' questions. He instead attacks the questions of Socrates as being intentionally harmful. We probably already know people in our own lives or in the media today who, when engaged in questions, doesn't answer them but skirts them and instead tries to flip the script on the questioner. Thrasymachus defends himself as superior to Socrates through being rhetorically more powerful than Socrates, which can equally be seen as an implicit physical threat toward Socrates too. Thrasymachus behaves like a graceless hater of speeches, whose only weapon is force and savagery. It seems to be fitting that the most savage man present should maintain the most savage thesis on justice. That is what Leo Strauss commented upon when examining the dialectic between Thrasymachus and Socrates. Eventually, Thrasymachus expounds an altered view that justice is in the interest of the strong because of obedience to laws. There is nothing new, and this idea is in fact reminiscent of the public orthodoxy that Thucydides stated was an integral aspect to Athenian exceptionalism during Pericles' funeral oration. Thucydides, as Pericles says in this most memorable speech, "We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law." In this sense, Thrasymachus' savage view of justice gets coated over with the order of obedience to law in much the same manner that our savage existence in the state of nature is supposedly expunged by the social contract theories of Hobbes and Locke. Savagery is painted over with the public benefit of law, but this is a law of compulsory submission, that sacred, unalterable legislature, as Locke says, which we have given our consent to by mere virtue of living under its jurisdiction. We do not have a choice, we must note in Thrasymachus's revised view of justice, but to accept that the strong rule over us because we must obey the law. Did we ever consent to this? The move by Thrasymachus is nothing more than a rhetorical shift, which is the hallmark of all sophistry. If the laws were established by the powerful, then obedience to those laws is still acting in accord with the interest of the strong, as Thrasymachus first barked out. Thrasymachus, then, is the embodiment of the society that he represents, a society that is characterized by power, savagery, and violence, and wields violence and power with savage intent. Thrasymachus responds to the supposed violent intrusion onto his power by Socrates with a threat, reminding Socrates of his powerful might, which is also an implicit demand to Socrates to begin apologizing and showering him with the praise that he seeks in order to soothe his bruised ego. In many ways, Thrasymachus is the same vulgar youth that Cicero worries about in his own treatise on political philosophy. But Thrasymachus is more dangerous insofar that he is not just a vulgar youth, but in fact a vulgar animal, a vulgar beast. He is the vulgar youth who hasn't matured intellectually despite maturing in body. He claims intelligence and wisdom, but when met with intelligence and wisdom, the intelligence and wisdom of Socrates, which stands so acutely contrasted against Thrasymachus, he gets defensive and retorts to his savage instincts by threatening Socrates. Any challenge to this worldview that promotes a savage life must be met with brutal force, as highlighted in Thrasymachus's initial response to Socrates, and also by Cleitophon's attempt to rescue Thrasymachus by rudely interrupting and simply restating the same savage claim of justice in a different manner. Say something loud enough and long enough, and it will be accepted as truth, which is foreshadowing the dictatorship of noise in the cave. That Thrasymachus's thesis on justice is savage is also embodied in his savage rhetoric and engagement with the man whom the Delphi oracle claimed to be the wisest in all of Greece, though Thrasymachus certainly sees himself as the wisest man in all of Greece. Where Socrates is poetic, eloquent, and insightful, Thrasymachus is crass, crude, and spiteful. Where Socrates acts as a gentle lamb, Thrasymachus acts and is even described like an ambushing lion. The very difference in language and mannerisms are meant to contrast Socrates, beautiful, inquisitive, and wise, with Thrasymachus, crass, crude, and spiteful, and highlight the level of thoughtful reflection and wisdom that the two have attained on the subject matter. The two could not be more antagonistic and oppositional, and this seems to be intentional on the part of Plato to highlight the gulf of difference between Socrates, the philosopher, and Thrasymachus, the politician posing as the wise man. The aesthetics of language in Plato's dialogues and here in the Republic is one of the most enduring features of his writings. The savagery of Thrasymachus is not just in his character, it is in his speech, and it is also in his view of justice, as we've just described. This is not lost on readers of Plato, one of whom said, "One might go as far as to say that Thrasymachus presents injustice incarnate, or the tyrant." Plato's philosophy is premised upon an examination of the social mind toward the good, the true, and the beautiful in escaping the chaos, darkness, and ignorance of the world. This dialectical element of Plato's philosophy plays itself out in the dialectic between Socrates and Thrasymachus. Their encounter is one of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Socrates coming into a head-on collision with chaos, darkness, and ignorance, represented by Thrasymachus. The speeches and inquiries by Socrates are beautiful and easy-flowing. There is a certain grace and eloquence to his language, while the speeches by Thrasymachus are crass, crude, and short. Furthermore, there is no beauty in Thrasymachus' actions towards Socrates. This is reflective of the savage city embodied by Thrasymachus and symptomatic of how the savage city responds to those who seek wisdom, truth, and virtue. Wealth, power, and prestige, all the things that Thrasymachus represents, defends, and seeks, are the only things worthwhile to pursue in the Thrasymachian worldview. In some way, then, he is not altogether dissimilar to Polemarchus, who also sees the pursuit of wealth and power, from wealth as part of the justice that comes with paying off debts, though Polemarchus is the first of the sophists to side with Socrates after listening carefully and reflecting upon Socrates' challenges. Even previously amoral Polemarchus is woken up from his moral stupor and coming to side with Socrates by being an engaged and attentive participant in the dialectic. This too is intentionally inserted by Plato and to be realized by the reader. Plato's supposed pessimism is also tempered by this ironic and implicit optimism. In this encounter between the savage fighter, Thrasymachus, and the wise sage, Socrates, the wise sage eventually tames the savage beast. It is a complete reversal of the encounter between Hector and Achilles, in which the wise and just individual overcomes the savage brute. By the end of the first book, Thrasymachus' combative and bombastic character and style has been tempered by the wisdom and insight being offered by Socrates. Socrates even claims to have become friends with Thrasymachus over the course of the dialogue. From a roaring animal attempting to ambush Socrates to a friend whom Socrates defends from libel was the result of the dialectic between the two, even if Thrasymachus' altered views concerning justice remain unknown to us, though the reality of living in Thrasymachus' savage city is just starting to become visible to us as the reader. Thus, Plato highlights for us how savagery is tamed, through words and language, and truthful words at that. The pursuit of wisdom is what overcomes savagery. To have met savagery with savagery, as Thrasymachus' original intent in attempting to entice Socrates into a savage fight, in which Socrates would have been stooped down to Thrasymachus' level, would have only begotten further chaos and violence and exposed Socrates as unwise and uninterested in the genuine pursuit of light. Thus we see how Socrates flipped the script against Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus was always baiting Socrates to stoop down to his level. If Socrates acquiesced to that, he would have shown himself to be unwise. But instead, through the dialectic, we saw how wisdom tamed savagery. But the taming of Thrasymachus isn't the exit into the light. In many ways, Plato's journey into the depravity and savagery of sophist philosophy is just beginning. Through the encounter with Thrasymachus, Plato invites us to think about the savage city and whether we live in it, as we've already discussed, and how to respond to the combative and violent impulse of such a city. While Glaucon and Adimantus defend Thrasymachus' savage city in their apologia of the benefits of injustice, the turn to Glaucon and Adimantus represent the logical end to Thrasymachus' violent city, which the two are attempting to defend: permissive nihilism, ending with murder, which is the celebration of the culture of death. Despite being listeners to the views of justice recently offered, it is evident that it had no impact upon Glaucon or Adimantus, who charge headlong into the dialectic and seek to defend Thrasymachus and his thesis against Socrates' rebuttal. In the conversation over the nature of the good and whether humans naturally act immorally, Glaucon and Adimantus not only defend Thrasymachus' original thesis, but their defense of Thrasymachus is the logical devolution demanded from Thrasymachus' original view of justice. Like the cyclical spiral in the latter half of the book of Judges, things are only getting worse as we proceed through the pages of Plato's Republic. Plato is now descending farther down into the pit of darkness and exploring the implications and logic of the sophists, which began with Socrates' examination of Thrasymachus. Glaucon's defense of the good is the opposite of Plato. But Glaucon's exposition of the good should be familiar to us. The good is that which is pleasurable to the body, desirable in of itself and for results, and desirable for results only. Glaucon expounds doctrines that are later promoted by the likes of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, the broader utilitarian tradition, and their heirs. The logic of humans as automata set in bodily motion, or, as the French materialist said, men who are machines. And this ends in humans seeing the good only self-centeredly, bodily, and mathematically. After all, Hobbes' philosophy of goodness is actually identical to Glaucon's bodily pleasures in of themselves. What is visible in Glaucon's three definitions of the good is that it turns from humans being stimulated, pleasure-seeking masses of matter in motion, his first definition, into humans becoming machines seeking out only material results, his final definition. The end result of hedonism is actually nihilism and the disintegration of human nature as we become Laputans. Plato is aware that the logic of Glaucon's first definition of the good eventually leads him to conclude that the ultimate definition of the good is that which is desirable for end results, even if Glaucon thinks that the first definition is the highest good in of itself. All three definitions of the good reflect the egoism and materialism of the sophists. In rapid succession, Glaucon moved from hedonism to empiricism and then to physicalism, which is the very logical devolution that hedonism demands. The problem with Glaucon's definitions of the good is that they are not really three definitions of the good at all. This is again a moment of irony that we are supposed to see as readers. The third definition of the good is the devolutionary logical fulfillment of the first definition that Glaucon began with. Glaucon's second definition is equally problematic since it is the fulfillment of atomistic hedonism, seeing everything as means to an end, and the end being self-centered pleasure through the usage of things in the world. What is desirable for results only is what is desirable in of itself in the atomized, egoistic, and self-centered philosophy of the sophists. This problem was dealt with in a tragic sense by later philosophers, like Jean-Paul Sartre, when he talks about the look, which dissolves into concrete relationships with others, and our want for self-pleasure exhausts itself in either masochism or sadism. That we are trapped in this being for itself is Sartre's more eloquent reappraisal of the tragedy of the good Glaucon defends as being desirable in of itself. That Glaucon sees the three definitions as separate indicates his own ignorance, which is not lost on Socrates and should not be lost on us as readers. Socrates baits Glaucon into highlighting the depravity of his views of the good and justice when he states that he is a, quote, slow learner. It is therefore unsurprising that after establishing these definitions of the good, that Glaucon presents his most famous analogy immediately afterward, the story of the ring of Gyges, which is the fulfillment, of course, of his own nihilistic views of the good, which Socrates has now successfully goaded Glaucon into revealing by posing as an ignorant, slow learner. This also reveals how ignorant Glaucon is. Glaucon just watched Socrates defeat Thrasymachus in a dialectical conversation. He ought to know that Socrates is, in fact, very wise and baits the sophists into exposing their ignorance. Glaucon has taken the bait. There is nothing to critique or find repulsive about the shepherd's behavior, Glaucon is arguing, because he has found a pleasurable end in his efficient actions of self-advancement. It is also impossible to critique the actions of the shepherd because Glaucon associates such behavior as humanity's natural state of being. What is often forgotten in this brief but famous story is that Glaucon stated before the story that the power to do injustice is freedom in its most natural form. The power to commit injustice is freedom, according to Glaucon. As Glaucon informs Socrates, we can see most clearly that those who practice justice do it unwillingly and because they lack the power to do justice. If in our thoughts we grant to a just and unjust person to do whatever they like, this is what anyone's natural nature pursues as good, but nature is forced by law into the perversion of treating fairness with respect. In other words, the ability to be savage is freedom in its most pristine phusos, in its most common nature, which is what the sophists teach to their students. Insofar that Glaucon and even Sartre are in agreement, and that both see the end of material existence as physical power struggle between subject consciousness and subject objectified, attempting to sublate one another, the dialectical tension that another great philosopher, St. Augustine, later called the libido dominandi, the lust to dominate, it is unsurprising that the unnamed shepherd seduces the queen, kills the king, and seizes the kingdom for himself. He is merely exercising his natural freedom, his want to advance himself and to gain power. And that, according to Glaucon, is justice. The exhaustive end to Glaucon's definition of the good is nihilism, which is why it ends in the ultimate form of nihilism, the killing of a human for a self-centered end. It is the ultimate form of theft, the theft of one's life. Virtue is completely absent in Glaucon's city because virtue is about self-restraint and order rather than licentious lust and an acceptance of the doctrine that the ends justify the means. But Glaucon's philosophy of ends justifying the means is given even more impossibility to critique because it is what is naturally natural by Glaucon's own admission. And the moral is the natural, and the natural is injustice. Therefore, Glaucon is arguing that injustice is, in fact, moral. Does that sound like it makes any sense? It's not supposed to, because it's all sophistry. This is why justice is injustice in the minds of the sophists. Glaucon's city is the opposite of the healthy and laboring city that Socrates would later describe. The city that Glaucon represents is the city of permissive nihilism ending in murder. By murder, Plato means death, much like how Philo's reading of the murder of Abel in the Bible is about the culture of death, allegorized and embodied in Cain, rather than the tale of Cain simply slaughtering Abel. The murder of the king in the ring of Gyges is not the central message being conveyed per se. Instead, it is the underlying foundation of the city Glaucon advocates for, premised on Glaucon's defense of Thrasymachus' thesis and his definitions of the good, which is the city that celebrates the culture of death as the highest expression of the natural freedom, which is also one of injustice. The story of the ring of Gyges is just an illustrative example of this culture of death. It is meant as an analogy to something more profound, the reality that we live in a city which celebrates death itself. Glaucon's city is not just savage, as was Thrasymachus' city. It is the city of death that results from being the savage city in of itself. We are meant to realize that Glaucon's city is the savage city of death writ large, the fulfillment of savagery in the culture, life, and practices of the city we live in. Glaucon's city of death, then, is the logical debasement of Thrasymachus' savage city. Thus, Glaucon's city is the city without virtue, and in comparison to Thrasymachus, it is Thrasymachus' city that is, ironically, more sober and more pedestrian than even Glaucon's. In other words, Glaucon's city is one of unrighteous philosophy. As a result, there is no light in Glaucon's city, as all persons selfishly slave away at their own desires and ends. And, more dangerously, we are all at the mercy of those with the power to commit injustice as the highest expression of freedom. Glaucon's freedom, ironically, is reminiscent of the tragedy of freedom in Sartre's modern classic, the freedom for the lust for domination and nothing more than that. Though in Sartre, we are anguished by this burden of freedom, while Glaucon celebrates this immorality and injustice because immoralism and injustice are just conventions that we create in the city to constrain the greatness and the freedom of the savage man. Glaucon, after all, boldly proclaims in front of everyone, "Indeed, every man believes that injustice is far more profitable to himself than justice." If injustice is our nature, and it brings about desirable results, then Glaucon's second definition should have been the only definition of the good, for that which is desirable in of itself is also what is desirable for results only. If justice is desirable only for results, then Glaucon's own logic should agree that people want justice because it is also desirable in of itself, which he does not believe because that would make justice the highest possible good rather than the lowest possible good. So which is it? Is justice desirable because humans are weak and therefore seek justice because it is in their self-interest as weak creatures to seek justice? Or is it the exact opposite? Are we naturally powerful and strong and therefore always seeking injustice to exercise that reality? Socrates has managed to expose all the internal inconsistencies of Glaucon's philosophy of the good and defense of injustice as naturally good without even saying a word. That shows you how wise Socrates is, by getting Glaucon to reveal all of the inconsistencies himself through his conversation, or rather his speeches, to Socrates. Glaucon has tangled himself in his own web. Do we all see the irony here in a supposed wise man whose very name evokes the owl of Minerva, trapping himself in his own sophistry? One would be almost moved to take pity on Glaucon, if not for his otherwise base views on the good and defense of natural injustice as man's natural mode of existence. The genius of Plato is fully seen in the conversations between Socrates and the sophists. By Thrasymachus' and Glaucon's own admissions, the savage injustice of the state of nature is the savage city of injustice that we live in. The social contract never changed anything, even in Glaucon's telling of it. The social contract still primarily serves the benefit of the powerful, despite some concessions to the masses, and the new incantations of repentance and sacrifice established in public religion to keep the image of justice in the midst of the public. The social contract simply gave injustice and savagery a new, polished shining. To obey the law is to be obedient to the interest of those who established the law in the first place. The public rituals and rites are grand spectacles that allow the wealthy to benefit his friends while harming his enemies, whilst maintaining the illusion of justice to the weak majority. And you see here how Plato is foreshadowing the story and the allegory of the cave. On this note, it is peculiar that Glaucon is simply defending the same view of injustice from Polemarchus and Thrasymachus, only this time within the parameters of legal contracts and the law of justice. The just city is still unjust, which is why Socrates critiques Glaucon and presents the evolution of the truly just city as evolving from the city of pigs to the city of philosophers through hard labor and a long time. Plato's descent into the depth of hell, however, is not complete. What could be worse than the savage city of death and lust writ large? Savagery leading to death and lust is the gateway to tyranny, which is to say that Thrasymachus' savage city is the pathway to tyranny. It is also to say that savagery leads to ignorance, and that savagery and ignorance are linked together as the two enjoined roads descend into the pit of tyranny. We, as modern readers in the 21st century, should consider this very deeply about the cities and societies we live in. Ignorance and savagery are the hallmarks leading to political tyranny. The most famous allegory of the Republic is the Allegory of the Cave. We have an entire episode covering the multitude of ways one can interpret the allegory. While it is undoubtedly true that this allegory also contains Plato's epistemology cannot be separated from his political philosophy, and the Allegory of the Cave cannot be separated out as anything but a continued examination of the question of what kind of city do we live in. After all, the entire book, the entire Republic, is an examination of that question masked by the theme of justice, as we said at the beginning of this lecture. Just as there are three identifiable stages of a city's growth to the ideal, there are three cities that are opposite of each stage. The opposite of the city of pigs is Thrasymachus' savage city. The opposite of the healthy city of honest toiling labor is Glaucon's city of deceit, lust, and theft. Instead of working hard to achieve anything of value, we merely steal it. We kill and we murder and we plunder. The opposite of the heavenly city of the philosophers is the dark and tyrannical city of the cave. Where the growth from pigs to light is the maturation of the Eidos, the cruel devolution of the city of the sophists runs in the other direction ending in the deliberate enslavement of humanity, preventing maturation into the forms. It is reverse engineering, social engineering, preventing the natural growth of seeds into fruit-bearing trees as they take on their own form. It should come as no surprise, then, that we begin in the dark cave, deep underground, like seeds, who are meant to be called up to the light of the sun. But this is no place of enjoyment, as Socrates makes clear. We are hemmed in, deceived, with walls enclosed around us. Like Sartre's hell, we are trapped with no exit, since a low wall has been built. The wall keeps us in place, as the captors deceive us with artifacts, echoes, and shadows. Does this sound familiar to anyone today? The cave is an entirely dark and physical place. The people along the wall carry only material artifacts. Some speak and others remain silent, which adds confusion to the senses, the same senses that are important to Glaucon's second definition of the good, and embodies the idea of the dictatorship of confused and inarticulate sounds, reminiscent of when Elijah flees from the sounds of the enraged masses, the violent crashes of thunder and earthquakes, to find solace in silent contemplation and the still small voice. After all, it is the still silence under the radiant light of the sun in which the freed prisoner of the cave is able to come to understand the truth. One is freed from the sounds of the cave, the dictatorship of noise, or the sounds of opinions, and it is only when one is freed from the sounds of the cave that one is actually free. Glaucon is no fool, however. Having learned wisdom from Socrates, he is aware that this appears to be a prison-like atmosphere. It is a strange image you're describing, and strange prisoners, Glaucon says to Socrates. Socrates, in one of his blunt moments of honesty, immediately responds, "They are like us." He openly states that they are like the prisoners. Athens is like the cave, and the sophists are the frauds, holding up artifacts and deceiving the imprisoned masses inside of the cave. We have moved from Thrasymachus' dog-eat-dog world of the surface to an enchained, dark, and cramped world of deceit, lies, and confusion deep underground. Socrates here admits that we live in the city dominated by the sophists, and that Thrasymachus' thesis, while not necessarily correct as to what justice is in fact the foundation of the city we inhabit. This is because the question of justice is linked to the question of the type of city we inhabit, and it is clear that we live in a city that was premised on Thrasymachus' thesis, and we have now reached the revelation as to what the end of Thrasymachus' city of savagery becomes. The cave is dark because there is no truth in it. The echoes and shadows deceive the senses to the point that the prisoners would in every way believe that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts, even though we know, as readers, that those artifacts, echoes, and shadows are deceiving and not true representations of the truth, but represent the false claims of the opinion of the senses established by the walls of the cave as truth. But the actual journey to the truth of the light, especially when having been ensnared in darkness and the world of false opinion for so long, is a tough and painful journey. The freed prisoner is pained and irritated, though after adjusting to the light and basking in the glory of the sun, he begins to know truth and find joy and happiness in having been freed from the ignorance and tyranny of the cave. What follows is one of the most remarkable short exchanges in the whole of Plato's Republic. The freed man, who has matured from ensnared seedling to blossoming and flourishing human, decides to descend back into the cave to help free the prisoners and bring them back up to the glory and happiness of the light of the true world. However, he is unable to adjust to the ignorance of the cave and appears to be stumbling and a mumbling fool to the prisoners. The prisoners ridicule him at first, but then come to see him as a madman who threatens their comfortable lives in the cave and subsequently kill him. Precisely because the best of the non-philosophers, the good citizens, are passionately attached to these opinions in the cave, they passionately oppose all philosophy. It is not just the ignorant masses who are attached to the false opinions which lead them to the killing of the philosopher, which is to say that ignorance is the culmination of savagery, and savagery is the culmination of ignorance. But it is, in fact, the best citizens who get their hands wet with the blood of the philosopher, precisely because it is in their interests to do so, for their interests as the ones who control the cave are at stake. The most interesting aspect to the allegory of the cave is the enslavement of humans in the cave and how total tyranny is not merely the end result of savagery, but is also linked to ignorance. The implication is that the world of the sophists, to which Socrates says that he and his companions are prisoners of the sophist's tyrannical cave, since the prisoners are us, is one of tyranny. The end result of sophistry is chaos, ignorance, and tyranny, the tyranny of the cave, a literal hell manifested due to ignorance and forced prevention of people to grow into wisdom. It is the city that is savage, deceitful, and tyrannical. The prisoners are kept in darkness, enchained, and prevented from maturing out of the darkness of the cave to the splendor of truthful brilliance, which is the light of the sun. The ultimate form of tyranny is ignorance, since for Plato, knowledge is related to virtue, and proper virtue is action and the putting on of one's forms, which is to say, to be fully living in accord to proper human nature. In this regard, Aristotle fully agrees with Plato that human nature is about the attainment of knowledge. In being enchained and prevented from the journey to the truth of the sun, the cave is attempting to reverse engineer human life with the power of spectacle and technology. After all, the people on the wall parade artifacts that cast shadows that keep the ensnared commoners entertained. They howl about to dizzy the senses, and great iron chains keep them shackled to the ground. This is not a tyranny built just solely on ignorance. Ignorance is compounded by the technologies of the cave, the artifacts that cast the shadows, the chains that keep us hauled to the ground. The people are attached to the world of opinions, which has, through legislation, spectacle, and technology, been fed to the cave dwellers as the pill of nobility and truth, despite it all being the pill of debasement and falsity. The cave dwellers do not know that these, their most cherished convictions, possess no higher status than that of opinion. The sophist leaders of the cave, those legislators who parade artifacts and cast shadows, on the other hand, are not enchained or confused, as the people in the cave are. The sophists know precisely what they are doing in keeping the masses attached and enchained to deified opinion as they freely move about in the tyrannical world. It is the elevation of enshrined opinion to the point of deification in the civil cult that is necessary to ward off the philosopher who comes to the cave to teach about the falsity of the world of opinion. The truth would crush simple opinion, but sacralized, sacred opinion draws the defense of the cave dwellers who see the philosopher as mad, ridiculing him at first, but in his determined persistence is murdered so as to save the realm of opinion. The tyrannical city is built on lies and other sacred myths that mask the reality of the savage city in which the people live. The cave is not merely the savage city of Thrasymachus or the city of death and deceit of Glaucon. It is both. Moreover, it is tyrannical precisely because of its savage, deceitful, and deadly character. Not only is the philosopher killed as he tries to bring the cave a message about the brilliance of the light of truth beyond the walls, the people inside the cave are completely dead in the Platonic sense. The mass men of the cave are not thinking minds searching for wisdom, but minds numbed and completely given over to the pit of opinion and desiring acceptance in the world of opinion, rather than taking on their form and pursue wisdom. They are not living souls at all. Socrates implies that the soul enchained in darkness will never realize he is in darkness unless he has glimpsed the brilliance of the light. But without this opportunity, the soul slumbers in eternal darkness and never cultivates virtue. And there are serious ramifications for the city as a result of this. The cave is the final devolution of Thrasymachus' savage city and Glaucon's murderous and licentious city. Plato has taken us from the world of beastly barbarism, Thrasymachus, to the dark depth of the underworld, the cave. But our hero, the philosopher, has been killed in his descent into the realm of the dead. In his impetuous enthusiasm, he was deemed a madman who threatened the truths of sacred opinion, threatened the order of the cave itself, and therefore had to pay the gruesome price as a threat to the public. Anyone who has an extensive knowledge of Plato might see here an esoteric commentary on the death of Socrates as the philosopher who re-entered the cave, the philosopher who was involved in the city of Athens, who was ultimately put to death by the best citizens of Athens, the politicians, the supposed wise men, in order to save the tyrannical city from the wisdom offered by Socrates. Having examined Plato's Republic as principally being one concerned with the question of what kind of city do we live in, moreover than what kind of city we should strive for, though it is concerned with that question too, the question of what type of city we should strive for is presupposed by needing to understand what kind of city we live in the first place. And in recognizing that we live in the city of death and tyranny, Plato's Republic is a work of resurrection, insofar that we begin with savage death, descend into the bottom circle of hell in the Allegory of the Cave, and emerge at the end of it all with the resurrection of error before the brilliant light of wisdom that grants true life to those who find it. Insofar that Er's resurrection correlates to his having attained knowledge and being informed that he is a messenger of truth to other humans, the coming into form and taking on of human nature is reflected by Er's death-to-life narrative at the end of the Republic. Since human nature is linked to the attainment of wisdom, and that the attainment of wisdom is the seed having now come to bear fruit, Plato's political animal is different than Aristotle's political animal, insofar that Plato's political animal is the social mind. The myth of is opposite of the cave. There is the light of brilliance as opposed to the darkness of shadows. A corpse is revivified by the light instead of remaining shackled to the ground in darkness. Is not confused by the dictates given to him, which stand in stark contrast to the confusion of noise and rhetoric from within the cave. In the story of justice is linked to knowledge, and that knowledge inculcates the habit of virtue that is necessary to be just. It is the ordering of one's mind to the good, from which knowledge, justice, and virtue flow. In this, one recognizes the reward of a life lived on earth, is not based on the public sacrifices and rituals enacted in civic religion, as Glaucon suggested, but is entirely linked to the logos and how one acts in revelation to others and the life lived in the city itself. Suffering is linked to the degree of virtue one has attained, the implied message being that the more knowledge and virtue there is, the less suffering there will be in the city. Plato's Republic is an invitation to awaken the slumbering mind to life. It is an invitation to invest and contemplate the nature of the city one finds themselves living in. Only after assessing the nature of the city can the individual know how to act and invest his time with that knowledge and virtue and help the rest of the city out of the pit of the cave. Socrates, in this sense, is Socrates, unlike the impetuous philosopher retold in the Allegory of the Cave, is the political animal, the social mind, seeking out wisdom from others, and in doing so, fulfills his social animus, but also awakens his partners into becoming thinking and reflective minds themselves. In this way, the movement from the city of pigs to the city of light commences, and as we noted, through Socrates' engagements and conversations with the sophists become wiser men. Polemarchus agrees with Socrates. Thrasymachus becomes a friend of Socrates. Glaucon is able to recognize that the cave, the allegory of the cave, is a description of their own society. They have become wise, awakened, because of their connection to Socrates. Plato then subtly informs us that we do live in the savage city. Whether we live in the cave remains to be seen, but always remains a present danger, because Plato makes clear that the devolution of the city finds fulfillment in the cave. Plato is inviting us out of the cave because the philosopher who descends into the cave risks death. So Plato doesn't descend into the cave with us, but calls us out of the cave through the awakening of the mind, which is the art of dialogue, the art of dialogos. Plato's dialogues are eternal because they invite us into dialogue with him, even after 2.5 millennia. Throughout the Republic, Plato satirizes the sophists and exposes their sheer depth of their savage ways. But Plato also indicates to us that we live in the sophists' savage city. And Plato is also warning that the city that the sophists represent is not merely savage, but will exhaust itself into tyranny and lead to human corpses being enchained in darkness. Plato's Republic is not a roadmap to utopia. It is a critique of the savage city that is now a work that allows us to ponder the most important question we can as human beings. What kind of city do we live in? That the work ends in the city of light, like Dante's journey through hell and purgatory, is equally telling, since Plato's work starts off in savagery and confusion, the mind wandering for union with the good, and ends with a vision of the good, however incomplete it is. Plato then leaves it to his readers to complete it. This is the enduring allure of Plato's Republic. It is an incomplete work because in being an incomplete work, it invites the reader to become a thinker, which is philosophy in its most primal and basic form. If you want to learn more about the political philosophy of Plato, I have a book available on Amazon, The Politics of Plato, which gathers together previously published essays as well as academic articles analyzing the Platonic dialogues. After all, Plato was, first and foremost, a political philosopher, before later Neoplatonists and Christianity helped transform him into the mystic and the metaphysician that we know him today. The book, the link is available in the description below here in this video, culminates in an analysis of the Crito and the Republic. It is imperative when you read and study Plato, although his work does deal with metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and other philosophical matters, his dialogues were, when they were written, and should remain, as they are read now, works of political philosophy.